Just want to remind everyone we're here for Grace Lee's weekly Sunday town hall. We do these every Sunday at 4 o'clock. This is part of Grace's outreach, keep everybody engaged in our time of social distancing. People feel isolated, but we've got a lot of certainly important topics to cover. And so we've been doing these each week over the past couple of weeks, and you can catch out any of our prior town halls on YouTube. We've featured some scientists, doctors, economists talking about getting our economy back on track, how to do contact tracing, and this week, obviously, we're going to be talking about Asian American discrimination in the time of COVID. We've got special guests, Chris Kwok and Tobita Chow, but without further ado, I want to Grace Lee to take it away. Grace, how are you doing today?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. I really appreciate all of you tuning in to a very important topic today on Asian American discrimination. And really thrilled to have our guest speakers here today. Chris Kwok is a mediator and arbitrator with JAMS. He serves on the board of the Asian American Federation, which is how Chris and I got to know each other as fellow board members at one time. And he also is on the board of the Asian American Bar Association. Tobita Chow is the director of Justice Global. Just a minute. A special project of People's Action to create a more just and sustainable global economy and defeat right-wing nationalism. He is organizing a progressive internationalist alternative to the growing tensions between the U.S. and China. So, we're here today because to talk about the attacks and the racial tensions that have come up because of COVID-19. A lot of it has been driven, unfortunately, by our president, who has been calling COVID-19 the China virus, the China flu, and has incited people across the country to attack Asian Americans on the whole, not just Chinese Americans, but particularly, although this is something that has particularly hit the district that I am working to represent in Lower Manhattan, Chinatown. One example I wanted to share really quickly was I had posted something on Facebook about how we wanted to help protect Chinatown businesses because of the disproportionate economic effect it has had, COVID-19 and the fears of COVID-19 have had on Chinatown businesses. And someone posted to a comment on my post and said, we only want to help Americans. We don't want to help Chinatown. And, that was one, really perfect display of how otherness when it comes to the discussion of Asian Americans, when it comes to the discussion of Chinatown and Chinese Americans, has really infiltrated into the conversation in a real way because of COVID-19. And so as a way of better understanding these issues, this is not something that, it's something that is very present and real today, but this is an issue that has lasted for centuries in America. And so as part of that, we wanted to have Chris and Tobita on to talk with all of you about the history of Asian American discrimination as a way of giving us a backdrop for understanding how this issue is playing out today. So today, Chris and Tobita will be providing presentations, and in the meantime, if you have any questions, feel free to throw them into the chat, and after they present, we'll continue to have our discussion. We'll allow people who are present to be able to ask questions. So without further ado, Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for this opportunity. It's good to be here with all of you today. And I'm just going to do a quick presentation and just start us off with a little bit of history going back more than 150 years. That's the beginning of the Chinese migration to America. It starts with the gold rush, and it really picks up steam 30 years later with the railroad, the transcontinental railroad. Here you see the workers. It's completed in 1869, and right around the time of the completion of the railroad is an economic depression in America, 1870. And the Chinese don't have work anymore in the railroads. They go around the country. They open grocery stores in the South, the Mississippi Delta Chinese. I don't know if any of you know, but that was a vibrant community for a while. They opened up restaurants. That's a restaurant from downtown Manhattan, which was famous for many years. They opened laundromats. And what they did was they raised something in the political question about called the Chinese question. And a lot of people didn't want Chinese people in their areas. They didn't think that the Chinese could become Americans. Part of that was whiteness. They were, not white, and organized labor organized against Chinese businesses. If you were white and you did business with Chinese people or businesses, you got boycotted. They just wanted to drive Chinese people from wherever they settled and were trying to make a living. Manufacturers got into the business. They would create, automatic washers and say, hey, don't go to the Chinese laundry. Buying a laundry machine is all American. Here you see a very sophisticated sort of ad illustrating sort of, Uncle Sam doesn't want you to use the Chinese laundry. And then, the Chinese question, if you can see this clearly, this is a very famous political illustrator of the time. And you see up there in the top, coolie, slave, pauper, rat eater. Those are the sort of things that came into the Chinese question as to whether or not the Chinese should be allowed to stay and to become Americans. And here you have a figure called Columbia, which represents the maternal instincts of America. She's America, protecting on the lower, at her knees, the Chinese person, the Chinese migrant in America against the mob, the working man mob, which was really leading the political charge against the Chinese. So, that's important to understand that, the political and economic framework that framed the anti-Chinese sentiment back 150 years ago, which ended in the Chinese Exclusion Act, which excluded largely Chinese immigration and then all other Asian immigration to America. And here you see, hip hip hooray, the white man is on top, let every Democrat and good citizens turn out and ratify this democratic measure. I think, the political messaging of the era, was different in the sense that there was no sort of like hiding what it was about. It was about sort of whiteness, keeping what they saw as the natural order of things. One of the things, and Tobita I know has this slide as well, is that the Chinese ate rats and brought disease with them. And so you see in 1900 in Chinatown in San Francisco, there was a bubonic plague outbreak. What that led to was a quarantine of Chinatown, and it was race-based. So if you were white and you lived in the area, they would draw the line around you so you wouldn't be part of the quarantine. But they blamed the Chinese and Japanese people of San Francisco for spreading the bubonic plague. Eventually that was challenged in the courts and it was found to be illegal, so it was removed. But while they were under that quarantine, the Chinese and the Japanese underwent forced vaccinations as well as quarantine. So that was an interesting sort of example in American history. And of course, whatever people thought about Chinese, they pretty much thought of all other Asians. So if you see this political cartoon, it's a US treaty with Korea. And on the bottom, you see, stop me, I'm not a Chinaman, I'm a Korea man, all the same as a Mexican man. So they really, the anti-Chinese sentiment often became just all anti-Asian sentiment. And of course, the political question back in the day was, what do we do with the blacks in the South, the newly freed slaves in the South, and the Chinese in the West? And one of the political cartoons suggested that the Chinese go east, while the freed slaves went west to solve each other's problems. I thought I would bring it till today and closer to Lower Manhattan, which I know is on our minds. If you are in Bowling Green in the Lower Manhattan and you're in front of the U.S. Alexander Hamilton Customs House, you might look up and see statues. Those statues are actually very famous by a very famous sculptor called the Four Continents. And this, the next time you go there, is Asia. And it's a white woman, actually. She's sitting there holding in her right hand an opium poppy seed with the statue of Buddha in her lap, which is very small. But to her right are sort of the Asiatics. sort of either Indians or coolies, not exactly sure if it's from India or from China, but those are seen as sort of like the poor oppressed masses of Asia, and that's the view. And I just wanted to sort of not contrast that, but to show you that in our contemporary world, as we walk around in our everyday lives, we're not very far from images that are over 120 years old. And sort of that brings us, I think, to today, because a lot of the things that we think about that might be new, or we think, oh, where's that coming from? We're not that far from our history. Our history is there. We should know it, and we should be aware of it. You should report it, even if it's not a crime. There are a lot of websites that have popped up to take complaints. And it's important that as a community that we take those complaints, because after this is done, or at some point, I think we should press our politicians to take anti-Asian harassment and violence seriously. And for Asian American community-based organizations, they should make a political point to talk about it. So that is essentially sort of my presentation. And so how do we, okay, I'm gonna exit there. That's the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to sort of have a discussion and take any questions that come later. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. And if you can just throw that link for the Asian American Federation into the chat, if you're able to, that would be helpful so people can reference that.
Will do.
Great. Tobita, do you want to go ahead and present?
Sure, thank you. Just a sec here. Cool. Great. So I think as all of us know, Trump and many others in the Republican Party, as well as right-wing media, have been using these talking points to identify COVID-19 with China and with Chinese people. So this is a photo that I'm sure many of us here have seen, where Trump relabeled in his notes for his speech, coronavirus, he relabeled that as the Chinese virus. So this language, the Chinese virus, Wuhan virus, and so on, are ways of identifying the disease with China and Chinese people, of making people think that Chineseness is what causes the disease. And so this is what we call the racialization of disease, the identification of a disease with a certain group of people. And as Chris noted, it's led to this rise of anti-Asian racism, a sharp rise in anti-Asian racism across the country. So I'm calling here from Chicago. We've seen it in Chicago as well. In fact, in early February, which is very early on in the course of COVID-19, it was before there were any lockdowns or anything in the US. So this was early February. I was in downtown Chicago and saw, I was right in front of a Chinese woman who was victimized in an assault. This man, and they didn't know each other, but this man came up to her and spat right in her face, which was a really shocking and violent thing to witness, and it was COVID related. So this is early February, very early in the course of this thing, and I knew then, seeing that happen, that the anti-Asian racism was likely to get very, very bad, because it's such a dehumanizing act to do to someone, to spit right in their face. Chris has gone over a lot of this. This has a longer history, the racialization of disease. Let's see. So he showed this image, this is from 1882 in San Francisco, representing malaria, smallpox, and leprosy sort of flowing into the San Francisco Chinatown. I think a thing to understand about this is that it is true that conditions in Chinatowns, in Chinese communities, tended to be unsanitary in the US in this period of time. But this was the product of oppression. Chinese Americans were impoverished and pushed into these substandard living conditions. And that was they tended to be relatively unhealthy conditions, but that was a product of the structures of the oppressive society at the time. But instead of understanding that this is a product of society, it was blamed on them and blamed on their Chinese heritage. And this has a longer history, a recurring history. The racialization of disease is a recurring feature of history in epidemics and pandemics. And it's not just Chinese or Asians that have been targeted by this. So going back to the Middle Ages, in Europe, we saw Jews blamed for the plague. So the plague was identified with Jews. The Black Death was identified with Jews. They were seen as the carriers of this disease and were targeted for it. In the US, in the 19th century, so we see here Chinese people being blamed for disease. We also saw other groups. So Irish immigrants in the 19th century, this was before Irish people became white. That Irish people today are white, but that was something that happened later. In the 19th century, Irish immigrants did not yet count as fully white, and they were blamed for cholera. Jewish immigrants were blamed for tuberculosis. Going into the early 20th century, Italian immigrants were blamed for polio. So the association of disease with a certain group, blaming that group for the disease, is a recurring reaction to these disease outbreaks. It doesn't just happen by race. Other marginalized groups can be targeted in this way as well. So, for example, very recently in the 80s, with the outbreak of AIDS in the US, this was identified with gay men. And in fact, AIDS was originally known under the Reagan administration as GRID, the gay-related immune deficiency. It was really identified with gay men. This process of racializing disease or identifying disease with particular groups, there's a long history to this, and there are two prongs with this. First, the targeted group suffers from discrimination, right? So the group that is identified with disease suffers from discrimination. The second problem, and this is a problem for everyone, is that this leads to really horrible public health decisions. If you identify a disease with a specific group of people, then you actually fail to take the steps necessary to contain and defeat the disease, because you miss how the disease will spread beyond the targeted group in ways that have nothing to do with the targeted group, right? So now, for example, here and now, the majority of COVID-19 cases in the US have like nothing to do with people catching it from people of Chinese descent or people who have come from China, right? And if you think incorrectly that it is an inherently Chinese phenomenon, then you're going to fail to deal with it properly. And that is, in fact, what we have seen in the US from our political leaders. This is an article in The Guardian from, I think it was last month or the month before that. It's about the missing 6 weeks, how Trump failed the biggest test of his life. This missing 6 weeks has to do with the period between January 20th and mid-March. So January 20th, really important date in the recent history of COVID-19. That was the day when we both knew about human-to-human transmission. So the world was informed. Everyone knew that COVID-19 could spread from person to person. It is also when the US had its first diagnosed case of COVID-19. This is in Washington. What happened after that date of January 20th? Well, for the first 6 weeks, Trump did nothing except for one thing. On February 1st, Trump implements travel restrictions on China. That's the only thing that he does between January 20th and mid-March, that 6 week period. He does nothing to monitor travel from other parts of the world, in particular Europe, and it turns out travel from Europe is a really important part of how COVID-19 spread in the US. And he also did nothing to deal with the spread of COVID-19 within the community spread within the US. So COVID-19 spreading from person to person within the US, having nothing to do with international travel. He did nothing to scale up testing or to prepare hospitals or encourage shutdowns. So during that 6 week period between January 20th and mid-March, the only thing he did was restrict travel from China, did nothing else to prepare the country or protect us from this disease. So what that means is during this period, the only thing Trump did was he focused on the threat that COVID-19 could come from China. He ignored transmission within communities in the US, and he ignored spread from other parts of the world, and in particular from Europe, which is a big deal because we know now from researchers that the biggest outbreaks in the country in New York mostly came from travelers from Europe, and it did not come from travel from China and other parts of Asia, right? So we know this because of sort of testing different genetic strains of COVID-19, that the majority of cases in New York came to us via Europe and not directly from China. And then this in turn has greatly impacted the rest of the country because many of the outbreaks in the rest of the US come from New York, this cluster in New York that mostly came from Europe. This 6-week period where the only thing that Trump could think about was restricting travel from China was an enormous failure, like the biggest failure in the long list of failures from the Trump administration. And he did it because he identified the disease with China, which made him think that restricting travel from China was the only thing that he needed to do. And then once he had done that, then he could just sort of wash his hands of the rest of the situation. And even now, when Trump is pushed on his response by journalists or whatever, he will always pat himself on the back for putting these travel restrictions on China in February. So he's still congratulating himself for doing these travel restrictions on China, and thinks that, this makes him a big hero and we should all be thanking him for doing this one thing, even though that's the only thing he did during this 6-week period, and that was totally inadequate. So to sort of state what I think should be obvious right now is that this is racist. The fact that during the 6-week period, the only thing that Trump did was put in place travel restrictions on China, that he totally ignored the way that it could spread to us from Europe and also spread within communities in the US. This is a product of racism. Racism makes it seem like Chinese people are the main carriers of the disease, and it makes it think that Europeans are not. So Trump is one of the extreme cases of this, but I want to be clear that this is a kind of racism that is systemic. It is not just a thing that Trump has. It's not just a thing on the right. The identification of COVID-19 with China and Chinese people was also promoted by, for example, mainstream liberal media. So, for example, newspapers and news broadcasts would regularly show images of Chinatowns or Chinese people for stories about COVID, even when they were talking about COVID in places that had nothing to do with China or Chinese people, right? So you could have a story about COVID-19 cases in Manhattan, and to go along with that news story, there would be like an image from Chinatown that has nothing to do with, or images of like Chinese people with face masks that has nothing to do with COVID-19 in Manhattan, but they use the image anyways because they have this racist association of COVID-19 with Chinese people, and they're propagating that through this use of images, right? So it's not just Trump, like a lot of our blame has to go on Trump, but there's a more systemic problem here of the racialization of this disease that has led to a range of bad public health decisions and this rise in anti-Asian racism across the country. So let's see. So what this has led to is, so again, the racialization of COVID-19, the identification of this disease with China and Chinese people led to some of the biggest missteps by the Trump administration, which has now led to the US being the center of COVID-19 in the world with now, well, I looked this up yesterday, 88,523 deaths, by far the highest concentration of COVID-19 deaths anywhere in the world. A comparison here that I think is important is with South Korea, which has suffered 262 deaths from COVID-19. This comparison is really poignant because something that the US and South Korea have in common is that we both got the first confirmed case of COVID-19 on January 20th, on the same day. So COVID-19 hit both countries at the same time. South Korea, the government and civil society groups went into action very quickly to contain this disease in a way that our leaders have totally failed to do here in the US. And the result is tens of thousands of deaths that did not have to happen. Rather than taking the steps necessary now to get us the help we need, allow us to take care of each other and contain and mitigate the spread of COVID-19, what we see from Trump and the rest of the right is efforts to shift the blame from themselves and on to China, and to use this as a major part of their efforts to win election this November. So this is a mailer that was sent out in, this is actually from California. It may also be in other states. What they're doing here is a couple things. First, they are identifying COVID-19 with China, and then they are tying Biden to China. So Beijing Biden is an epithet that Trump and others in the Republican Party are using regularly. So this is a major narrative that they're going to use consistently between now and November, identifying the pandemic with China and blaming it on China, and then tying Biden to China. And this is an effort to absolve Trump of all responsibility and to cast him as the one who's going to protect the country from China, and that's why you should vote for him. It's not just Trump. So this is from Illinois. Adam Kinzinger is a member of Congress representing a district that's in Illinois that's sort of on the outskirts of the Chicago metropolitan area. So this is a really striking anti-China image, again, blaming COVID-19 pandemic on China and positioning himself, Adam Kinzinger, as the hero that's going to save American people from China. That's why you should vote for him. So there are a lot of other examples of this. I'm sure there's a bunch of these in New York State as well, of Republicans really going all in on these images of China being the biggest threat. So vote for Republicans because they're the ones who are going to protect the country against China. And they're using this rise in anti-Chinese sentiment under COVID-19 in hopes that that's going to be the key to them winning elections in November. It's not just candidates for office. The whole right-wing media machinery has locked into this as well. This is Tucker Carlson on Fox News. His slogan for talking about the COVID-19 is that this is part of the China threat. And throughout all of this right-wing rhetoric about the threat of China, it's all very well calculated to increase anti-Chinese and more broadly anti-Asian xenophobia. You know, sometimes they will say that they don't mean to be racist, that they're only criticizing the Chinese state, the Chinese government, and not Chinese people. But it's very clear that these are just empty words. The images they use are carefully calculated to create hatred and resentment and fear of people of Chinese descent, not just the government. People on the right will regularly question the loyalty of people of Chinese descent. So some of you may have seen Wei Jiazhang, a Chinese American journalist. She was pushing Trump on his COVID-19 response, and he responded to her, "Why don't you go ask China?" As if this Chinese American journalist is somehow a representative of China rather than a journalist for US media, an American journalist. We also see other things like they are threatening to there are figures on the right who are calling for bans on Chinese international students in U.S. colleges, threatening to cut off access to enrollment in U.S. colleges for international students from China. So these Chinese international students, they're just young people, they're students, they want to get a degree. They do not represent the Chinese government, and yet they're being attacked by the right. So when they say, my point here is that when they say that, they're only criticizing the Chinese government, and they don't mean to attack Chinese people, they can say that, but their actions and their other words belie that. So why are they doing this? So for one, they desperately need a scapegoat. The irresponsibility and the cruelty of Trump and the rest of the Republican Party is leading to tens of thousands of needless deaths. It could reach 100,000, a couple 100,000, who knows? It leads to these horrifying scenes at hospitals, mass unemployment, huge disruptions to everyone's lives, a much longer and slower recovery than we could have had. In countries that have dealt with this properly, like Taiwan, life is kind of back to normal. South Korea, there's been periods when bars and nightclubs and karaoke clubs are able to open again, right? And they are able to do this safely because they have actually responded to the pandemic properly. Here in the US, I don't know when we're going to be able to return to that kind of regular life in a way that's safe. Although I know that many states are reopening and trying to reengage in that activity, even though it's going to lead to massive deaths. So the impact of the responsibility and cruelty of Trump and the GOP is enormous, and they really cannot possibly take responsibility for this thing, to do whatever they can to avoid any accountability for all of this pain and suffering. And their only hope is to shift the blame onto a scapegoat, which is China. So, it's worth noting that it's true that the Chinese government can be criticized for their response to COVID-19. They made some mistakes. In particular, there was about a 2-week period before January 20th, so 2 weeks before January 20th, in early to mid-January, where there was a lack of transparency from local officials in Wuhan, where it first broke out, as well as some of the national leadership in China. There's some problems of the lack of transparency that delayed public warnings that there was a pandemic. So that's a problem. So there's this 2-week period that was a problem from Chinese officials, lack of transparency. However, those 2 weeks were then followed by Trump's 6 weeks of inaction, and these early errors on the part of Chinese officials cannot explain why the US has handled this so much worse than almost every other country on the face of the planet, right? So pointing the finger towards China does not explain why the US is headed for 100,000 deaths while South Korea has under 300, okay? So scapegoating is a really important need for Trump and the GOP. They need to shift the blame onto someone else in order to maintain their hopes of winning elections this November. But there are also other political interests driving the rise in anti-China politics, anti-Chinese politics. And a lot of this is related to US foreign policy. And in fact, we need to understand that this rise in anti-Asian racism is closely connected to anti-Chinese foreign policy, the relationship between the US and China. Right? These things are closely connected. The status of people of Chinese descent and other people of Asian descent within the US is closely connected to these foreign policy relationships between the US and China and between US and Asia more broadly. So there is in the United States what we call a national security establishment. This is the folks running the Pentagon and the Defense Department and sort of the most powerful foreign policy think tanks. So in this national security establishment, there has been a rise in anti-China hawks, people who are calling for greater confrontation with China. They want more economic confrontation. They want more money in the military budget in order to increase the ability of the US military to take on the Chinese military. This is an article about that from early March, saying that, you know, we need more money in the budget to compete with China for naval power. Note that the US military budget is hugely bloated and has gotten bigger and bigger under Trump. What is it at now? $730 billion with the military budget for this year. There are a lot of other better things that money could have gone to this year, right? So if it had gone into healthcare, we would have been much better off, but instead it's going to the military budget. But that's still not big enough for anti-China hawks in the national security world. So I want to note that this is a bipartisan phenomenon. There are people in the national security establishment from both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. So this is a thing that unites Republicans with establishment Democrats. Their situation, these anti-China hawks in the national security establishment, is that, and they will speak about this openly, they have been wanting a more confrontational policy towards China from the United States, but they've been frustrated because the American people, so the vast majority of American voters, aren't really interested in moving towards an arms race or military confrontation with China, because this country has been stuck in these unending wars for like 2 decades, and the vast majority of people are really sick of it. There's very little appetite for a new confrontation with an even more dangerous adversary. So these anti-China hawks have been frustrated because not enough people in the country are supporting this increased confrontation with China, but they see an opportunity now because the COVID-19 crisis has convinced a lot more people in the US that China is a threat to them. And so for them, this is an opportunity to take this growing anti-Chinese sentiment and push it into this foreign policy agenda of increased confrontation with China. So this is serving a political purpose for this very powerful interest group within US politics, right? So it's not just like ignorant people being racist, and it's not just the Republican Party wanting to use anti-China sentiments in order to get re-election. There are also these powerful interest groups, for example, in the national security establishment, who see this as an opportunity to move their agenda and get what they want from American voters. Let's see. So let me get this part. Okay, so that's why we're seeing this push in Republican political campaigns for this this focus on anti-China messaging. It's how they are going to win re-elections, they hope. It's also part of moving this anti-China political agenda that is supported by a lot of powerful interest groups in the country. So I want to wrap up now by just saying that this is the opposite of what we need. This rise in anti-Chinese, anti-Asian racism, and this rise in anti-China politics is the opposite of what we need right now in the middle of this crisis. What we really need is anti-racist solidarity and global cooperation to beat the COVID-19 crisis. We need global cooperation. US-China cooperation is especially crucial. And this is already happening, but very imperfectly. I'll just name a few examples of this. So since February, China has massively scaled up production of respirators and ventilators and other medical supplies, things that we need more of in the US right now, and that people all around the world need more of. But because of shortages, global shortages, people all around the world are competing to outbid each other for these crucial medical supplies. And this is a tremendous failure of the so-called free market, and we need global cooperation to fix it. And would have to happen with the US and China being on board with figuring out a system to get these medical supplies where they need to be to fix the huge failures of the global market. So that's the thing that we need to see. It's not what we're seeing right now, but it's something that we need. We've seen Chinese American community organizations across the country reaching out to contacts in China to get PPE, personal protective equipment, to local hospitals and places where they're needed locally. We've seen doctors and nurses between the US and China, as well as other countries, reach out to each other for help. So this is a tweet from a specialist at Johns Hopkins, where they met with their counterparts in China to learn from their hard-won experience that they had in China on what it takes to actually deal with COVID-19. And this is really touching that they ended the call with the Chinese doctors praying for the doctors at Johns Hopkins. Researchers are really showing the way about the global cooperation that we should all be engaging in. So this is an article about US and Chinese researchers teaming up to investigate the origins of COVID to really figure out where this came from so that we can defeat it better. So while the US government and the Chinese government are fighting with each other, researchers are doing what they can to circumvent and get around these international tensions that are happening at the government level. And in addition, scientists are teaming up together all around the world to do research into treatment and a cure. So this is an article from New York Times. COVID-19 changed how the world does science together. Never before, scientists say, have so many of the world's researchers focused so urgently on a single topic. Nearly all other researchers ground to a halt. And the article goes on to say that scientists have sort of stopped worrying about who gets credit for what. They're publishing all of their findings publicly, sharing it worldwide, not worrying about who gets credit for what, just sharing all of the results with each other because they're so focused on getting results as soon as possible for everyone around the world. And so they're engaging in this deep kind of cooperation for the betterment of all of us. So we see this cooperation happening across borders already. Our leaders should be making these efforts at global cooperation easier instead of undermining them. And that's both what we need to beat this pandemic. And it is also a super important counter to this rise of anti-Chinese politics and the rise of anti-Asian racism that has come with it.
Great. Thank you so much, Tobita. It really is a very comprehensive view on the past and where we are presently. And I think there are a few really important takeaways from that, which is the media's role in continuing and President Trump's role in furthering centuries-old racist tropes against Asian Americans and particularly against Chinese Americans, how this affects policy towards Asian Americans and towards our foreign partners, as well as just thinking about the effects that it has here in the United States. So one thing that wasn't brought up, but I think is really important to talk about is the competing narratives of Asian Americans in history. So at the same time that we are talking about how Asian American, there are these racist ideas about Asian Americans being transmitters of disease and the source of issues, there's also this idea of Asian Americans as model minorities. And I think that that they are successful and they go to good colleges and they test well. And I see that that tension of that model minority trope is very relevant, especially to New York, where we have a lot of issues around education. And in fact, in New York City, where the poverty rates for Asian Americans are at 20%, and that is very similar almost to Black and Brown communities. So wanted to hear from both Chris and Tobita on that, the model minority stereotype and how that affects the Asian American community.
Yeah, I think that, it's twofold. I think for policymakers and people in government, they really do believe Asian Americans to be, I guess, for lack of a better word, white adjacent or honorary whites. And so they don't, when told about needs of the Asian American community, whether it be economic, social, or political, they have a hard time processing that. I found that to be the case. They really have a hard time understanding the issues and the challenges facing Asian American communities. And so it's like, even before we get to the problem, we have to talk and convince people there is a problem. I think that's that itself is problematic. And I think the second part of the competing narratives for Asian Americans is that Asian Americans really need to understand that they're being used, that when you exist within a systemic system of racism, you are used in whatever is useful at the time. So I think that Asian Americans need to stand up. They need to be politically conscious. They need to understand how they're being used. They need to be participants and affect the political process, be engaged in a way perhaps they haven't been before. So.
And specifically around this issue of COVID-19, how can Asian Americans be proactive and our allies be effective in kind of turning the tide on the conversation about against like the racist attacks against Asian Americans and the like?
Tobita?
Yeah, I think so. I think one of the opportunities here is so like most people in the U.S., even people who care about having anti-racist politics, are really not used to thinking about anti-Asian racism. So Chris mentioned this. So I think there's a lot of people who want to engage in multiracial solidarity and to have the back of people of Asian descent in the U.S. really feel like at a loss as to how to do that, and like how to what are we in Asian diaspora experiencing, like how can we be supported, what it is that we want. So I think there's like an opportunity, like a historic opportunity for Asian American communities to step up and exercise some political leadership to tell the rest of sort of the left to progressive to liberal part of the political spectrum, like here's how we're going to lead in this moment, and here's what we need from the rest of you. Because I think like for the first time in a long time, we have like a lot of allies, non-Asian progressive liberal allies, who want to hear from us, like what is the solution, right? So there's a moment for us to step up in a new way in U.S. politics. And I think one of the struggles right now is not just with the Republican Party, but with a lot of establishment Democrats who are sort of going along with the anti-China politics. So the DNC has declared, in the Biden campaign, they've declared that they're going to respond to Trump's attempts to tie Biden to China by saying like, no, Trump, you're being the one you're soft on China. You need to be tougher on China. And that's a message that actually just re-emphasizes the whole anti-China narrative in a way that's very dangerous. And I think there's an opportunity because a lot of people who are, maybe kind of centrist in their politics and wouldn't listen to a lot of what I would say under normal circumstances, but can still see that this rise in anti-Asian racism is a problem. And it's an opportunity for us to say like, okay, if you really care about that, here's what you need to do. And one of the things you need to do is you need to change your messaging, your political messaging around China and Chinese people. So I think that's like a space that we can sort of step into as the API community in the US.
Yeah, and I think we need to, we've been Asian American activists in New York City have been pressing city government to be responsive. And to de Blasio's credit, he's done some work along with NYPD and other organizations, New York City Commission on Human Rights. They've been out there, but they've only been out there because the Asian American activists have been pressing them behind the scenes. We can't relent. We need to keep on pressing, and we can't let their response only be a public relations sort of like, like feel-good messaging. And that's why reporting to things that have gone online like Asian American Federation and other sites is important, because it's not only things that count as crimes and civil violations, but it's other things that are captured as harassment. And the reason that we're collecting that data, because no one else will, that's number one. Number two, at the end of it, I think we can really write a paper, a report, so that we can continue this education, because it is the two-front battle. We need to educate policymakers about anti-Asian harassment and what it looks like, what forms it takes, because it's slightly different. A lot of the anti-hate laws on our books are based on the lynchings and killings of African Americans, so really high violent crimes, which thank God no one has died yet within anti-Asian violence. But quite honestly, given where we're going, and we're going to be out on the streets and people are going to come out, and it's a terrible economy, we hope that all this work will help prevent that from happening. But we also need to stop that, because quite honestly, for the first time, I think many Asian Americans feel unsafe walking on the street. And I think that is a new political consciousness for most Asian Americans. And I think we need to recognize that. We also need to recognize that African Americans have had that fear, for 400 or 500 years on a much more sort of terrorist level. So we need to be aware, fight for our rights, but we also need to understand sort of how we engage in that system that's been here in America for a long time.
Yeah, Chris, I think that's a great point. And something that, you and I had talked about is with President Obama's presidency, they're kind of entered into conversation that we were in a post-racial America, that racism didn't exist anymore because we had elected our first African-American president. And so it allowed people this opportunity to say, oh, well, I voted for Barack Obama, there's no racism, and he's the president now, and there's no more racism in America. And we are kind of now coming back to that kind of having this boomerang effect now, where our lack of recognition of overt racism in America has led to kind of a complacency in some ways, and also kind of given rise to increased racism. So, I think that that's really important for us all to recognize that racism still exists in America, and it's not only against Asian Americans, but it's also against Latinos, and it's also against the African American community, and we need to be very active in fighting that. I want to just I'm going to unmute Jan Lee, is a community activist and in Chinatown, has been very vocal about the issues that we are seeing locally. And he has a question. So Jan, I hope you don't mind. I'm just going to let you go ahead and ask your question.
That's okay. And this is, I've been in Chinatown a long time. My family has a long history here. We've had businesses here. We are noticing over the years, as businesses come into Chinatown, they capitalize on a very, sometimes an exaggerated past. And it was so important that Chris started off our presentation with history, because that history over time has been twisted into a narrative that creates a constant othering of Chinese people in America. And as the speakers had said, that we live under this continual perpetual foreigner environment. And some of the things that I can talk about is, right here on Mulberry Street, a few feet away from my building, is a business that has a drink there called the White Geisha. There's Namwa Tea Parlor is marketing his frozen dumplings, originating from the Bloody Angle. Appetique, which is a bar on Doyer Street, lures people in as though you're going into an opium den. There's, Pete Wells had used his review to talk about the Chinese tuxedo, referencing for several paragraphs about Chinatown's violent past and how the hatchet men would chase people down the street and cut them up. 50 Bowery, experienced a lot of embarrassment when they had a press release announcing the new bar in their hotel would be opium themed. You know, I'm right on Moscow Street, and there's a woman who sells $1 dumplings, and she's been there for very long. She's actually quite a fixture here in Chinatown. Time and time again, tour guides will stop in front of her place of business and create this narrative that she's just like the soup Nazi on Seinfeld. And the reason is that there's a narrative that's created around her where she is distrustful, and you don't know if you're going to get the correct number of dumplings, and you don't know if she's going to give you change or not. And this creates this atmosphere. Imagine tour guides, hundreds and hundreds of people, being educated under this false narrative, really just based on the fact that she may not speak English that well, but we're ignoring right under our noses in Chinatown businesses that are capitalizing financially on microaggressions and really making money off of this community. This is not 1920, this is 2020. And so my question to you, Grace, is what do you offer as ways that consumers can use their behavior to alter and to stop this kind of making business on Chinatown around these antiquated notions that Chris has so eloquently brought up?
That's a big question, Jan. I don't know if we can answer that in this one call.
Well, I know that I don't shop there. I'll start with myself. I don't share my dollars with people who do that, and I would hope that other people would not.
Yeah, I think that's at the heart of it. I think it's about, once again, it's about competing narratives, and I think there are businesses, second, third generation businesses in Chinatown that celebrate and provide services and food in a way that is non-discriminatory, that understands the real history, is connected to the real sort of like main line of Chinese America without indulging in stereotypes to draw you in. Because quite honestly, when you do, they're extremely powerful, because that's what most of people outside of Chinatown think. So it's easy to tap into that. It's really easy money. And I think that, you know, the hard part is talking, telling people, celebrating the people that, you know, we think deserve it, because they're really just updating, you know, their family business, let's say the Chinatown Ice Cream Factory, in a way that celebrates the authenticity and realness, the intermingling of Chinese and sort of American cultures. And I think that's really the way we can do it, is to celebrate and to patronize those businesses that do it, we think in the right way. And, you know, I've gone to try out their food of some of the businesses you've mentioned, not any good, not even good food, you know, to go, you know, and but obviously the future of Chinatown and the people that profit off stereotypes don't deserve to profit off stereotypes. They really, you know, sort of do damage to their own community. So I certainly agree with you there. And I think that one needs to be aware of them, speak about them, talk about the critique, place them within a narrative of history, understand where we are, understand that the history is in a statue right above us when we're in Bowling Green. You know, now, you know, every time I go to Bowling Green, I think about that statue and I think that's Asia. Yeah. And maybe we can begin to talk about those statues and the education we could build around that, and what we could propose to counter narrative that. It's there in stone. We look at the posters that I shared with you 120 years ago, that's the past. No, the past is here and it's above us. It's right above you when you're walking. So.
Yeah, well said.
Grace, we have a few people who've joined us on the phone. I want to be sure they get the opportunity to participate in this discussion as well. If you're joining us by phone, you can hit *9 on your phone. It'll raise your hand and indicate to us that you have a question. We'll put you on. Anyone else who has a question, there's a little button you can push there to raise your hand, or you can just type it in the chat and we'll get to you.
Okay, and we have a question from Shane in the chat. What is your recommendation for what public officials on the city level can do to help educate the public and combat the rise in hate crimes in our neighborhoods? And, you know, first of all, I think it's like what we've been saying throughout this conversation. Tobita and Chris, feel free to chime in as well. We need to take anti-Asian racism and discrimination seriously. And recognize that it is an issue for our city, for our country, And our elected officials should not just be delivering platitudes on social media about Asian American racism, discrimination. They need to start taking action. And what that looks like is, one, working hand in hand with the DA's office, working hand in hand with local police and others to ensure that crimes committed against Asian Americans are properly reported. It's around, public service announcements, talking about, I've seen like some great postings on social media about, the hashtag I'm not a virus, and that elevating that conversation around Asians and calling it out when it happens. I think that I think the reporting piece is very important. I generally sense that culturally Asian Americans are less likely to report crimes against them, and I think that really hurts us because we don't have the tangible data to demonstrate that this is a real issue. And now that it's happening more and more, we have to ensure that we are able to report it and we have the numbers to stand behind. And that's really important for us.
Yeah, and
the idea of,
yep,
sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, no, and I think we really need to press, let's say, the Manhattan DA, who has quite honestly not been very friendly to Chinese American and Asian American interests in his prosecution choices. We need to challenge him to say, hey, you really need to take this seriously. 75% of anti-Asian harassment involves harassment, like verbal harassment. And of that verbal harassment, 16% involves spitting or something like that, right? And if you're an Asian American female, you're 2.5 times more likely to be harassed than an Asian American male. So really, so these are facts that I've gotten from Asian American sort of collecting sites. The government is not going to collect them. We need to collect them. We need to take it. We need to press the DA's office to say, you know what, make an example of people so that we can feel safer in the street, and let's not, sort of go after sort of, the everyday stuff, but we need to make an example to show that Asian Americans are protected from this type of harassment, because who knows where it's going to lead. Greater violence if it's unchecked.
Great. Tobita, do you have some other thoughts, like from a grassroots perspective, how we can start organizing as a community around these issues?
Yeah, I think there is a role for us working from the grassroots to lead in the creation and promotion of alternative narratives, right? So there's this powerful narrative that the disease is inherently Chinese or Asian, and that comes from Chinese or Asian people. And I think we should be looking into what are counter narratives that can be effective at creating like getting different kinds of images into people's minds. So I know one of the someone I know who's a grassroots organizer in the Chinese American community in Philadelphia was sharing about how people in his organization have been working so hard to talk to their relatives or connections they have in China to get masks to local hospitals in Philadelphia, and that they've been working really hard and raising all this money and really trying to sacrifice a lot for this, and then they turn around and they get attacked by this anti-Asian discourse in the media from politicians, and it's really painful. So I don't want to fall into this trap of thinking that we need to act like we're model citizens in order to earn dignity. I don't think that's true, but I do think that there can be opportunities where we can promote different kinds of narratives about the role of Asian Americans in the U.S. In this moment that can sort of counter the sort of dominant right-wing narratives that we're all dealing with nowadays. Another thought that another discussion I've had is around like how many Asian Americans and Asian immigrants are the ones who are actually taking care of everyone else as healthcare workers, right? So there's these different narratives that we can maybe figure out how to develop and put forward in ways that will really resonate with people and start to change people's hearts around this.
We have a question on the phones, Grace. I wanted to get to that person. So it's a 212 number and then 696. You have a question if you want to.
Yeah, this is Irving Lee. How you doing? I like to concur, and I like to congratulate Tobita and Chris. Excellent presentations. But I just want to follow up on the issue of the national security state that's actually driving this policy. This is basically a 9/11 do-over, where 9/11, the Arabs and Muslims were accused of doing 9/11 and launched a war on terror. And this is being played out again against China. And of course, the basis of it is China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is a geopolitical option for development that does not rely on war for development as opposed to U.S. foreign policy, the Middle East Project, as well as the Israeli Greater Israel Project. So you have these conflicting forces that are at play here, and that's something that we basically have to tell the people, tell the American public what's really going on, who's driving it and why it's being driven the way it is. Because this narrative of China did it occurred early on when Wuhan was announced. You had people saying that it came from a biolab in February, or it came from the Wuhan market early on. So this kind of ideation has been going on from the very, very beginning, very similar to what happened in 9/11. So I think the role that we would need to play is to expose who these forces are. And I want to point out a document that the Project for a New American Century, which is basically the national security state organization that is part of the national security state, had wrote a document called Rebuilding America's Defenses, which you can get online. And it talked about an advanced form of biological warfare that can target specific genotypes may transform biological warfare from the realm of terror to a politically useful tool. So this is what is being carried out, I believe, right now. And that's something that we have to demonstrate and show and identify these people, who they are. And basically, they're both part of the Democratic and Republican parties. It's bipartisan, unfortunately. So this type of blame China is going to be there from the very beginning. And it's going to continue, unfortunately, as this war on terror, this basically hybrid war in China will continue. And basically, it's been going on for a long time now with the specialized high school tests being targeted, and the building of jails in our community, and all the other attacks on our community. The property issues, the property tax issues, are attacking our community as part of maybe the overall strategy they have on us. So it's not an accident that's happening right now. Thank you.
Good point. Good point, Irving.
Thanks, Irving. Yeah, I agree that what we see and what we've seen for centuries is that these racist attacks and this discrimination ends up playing out in policy, and that's where it can get it can lead to dangerous policy for Asian Americans, whether it's the Chinese Exclusion Act or other things. And we have to be really cognizant of that as that develops. I would also say that you're exactly right in connecting this Muslim hate after 9/11 to what's going on with Chinese Americans right now with the COVID-19. And absolutely, we need to call on the DA to open up investigations on these hate crimes. And Chris is right that they are not doing enough right now. We need to be more actively involved there. So I want to see if there are any other questions and I see a question now from Alan. I'm wondering how much the Asian American community was affected by the deleted tweets CNN uncovered from the new deputy director of HHS for Public Affairs. Were they seen as hurtful, or were they just dismissed as more buffoonery and ignorance from Trump administration hires? Tobita or Chris, do you have a thought on that?
In any other administration, this person would be gone. But I think because Trump sets the tone at the top, and it's so outrageous, and it's coming from the highest podium that our country has to offer, one of the most powerful political posts in the world, that now normalizes things for his Secretary of State, for people like, Pompeo to really just say things like, I have lots of evidence, just can't share it with you about China. And then he's still our Secretary of State. And things like this, normally we get all these guys removed, but it shows you how normalized our crazy world is and how much people in his administration can get away with. So it's a really dangerous thing that the people like us who are fighting against these things almost don't have the time to fight against this person because Trump is taking so much of it and he's like providing so much air cover. And I think that I think that's what it illustrates more than anything else, is the dangerousness of our times. And I just want to say that one of the things I've been thinking about, thinking about coming out of this, that looks like the pandemic will last a couple of years in one form or another as we deal with it. There will be economic carnage close to the Depression or at least a Great Recession. We need to think about the essential but expendable workers that have been bringing us our food, our groceries, and been working at the markets. The essential but essential workers like the hospital, the police. We celebrate them rightly, but we have not talked enough about the essential but expendable workers. And I think that working together with people who are mostly African American, Latino, who have bore the brunt of these things together coming out of this is going to help us create political coalitions, create a better society. And that's really what we need to focus on, because this has been a real reordering of what we think is normal. The normal that we lived in wasn't that great anyway for a lot of people. So let's take this as an opportunity to create a more fair world. And if we think about the essential but expendable people that have been serving, like I've been at home and I feel very, very guilty when people bring me my groceries. Let's think about how we can build a better world for them. And I think if we do that, we're going to create multiracial coalitions naturally. We're going to create a better society. And I think that's what people here on this call really care about.
Yeah, I mean, it's very important. I think Asian Americans, we're not going to defeat racism on our own. We need to be part of a broader struggle for racial justice. And, I think one thing that we should be mindful of is that right now, Asian Americans as a whole have a much clearer sense of the dangers of racism that we're facing. We have a shared interest with other people of color, but relationships between Asian communities and, say, Black communities have not been great, and they're not great. So we have a shared interest in racial justice right now, but there are also divisions that we need to be intentional about overcoming. Just going back to this question about this deputy director of HHS, like, is it just buffoonery or ignorance? I mean, it is buffoonery and ignorance, but that's really a feature and not a bug of the ideology running powering the Trump administration, right? Like, this is a core part of this form of politics. Yeah.
Great. I'm going to open it up to a question on the phone right now. Your phone number is 732. I'm going to go ahead and let you talk. Actually, Al, maybe you can allow that to happen.
Yeah. Your phone number ends in 718. You're live. You had a question? Hello?
How can we get involved in Grace's campaign?
That's a great question. There's lots of ways. You can go to Grace Lee's website right now. It's Grace Lee, Lee, FOR, assembly.com, and sign up to volunteer. You can follow Grace on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. She's on all of those platforms. Grace Lee for NYC, GRACELEE FOR NYC. And keep the conversation alive. There's phone banks going on all the time. We'd love to get you guys engaged with those. Josh is on the line. Josh, say hi to the people. He's following up with everybody, but we can put you in touch with Josh and line you up with the phone banks. And in addition to that, I mean, like I said, these online conversations and getting sort of active and engaged if you want to volunteer for the campaign. We've got, Grace has been going out in the community and doing some mutual aid work. Grace, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. And, you know, right now we've been, you know, there are a lot of people in the district, as Chris said, and across the country, frankly, who are really struggling as a result of COVID-19 and the shutdowns to the economy. So what we've been doing is gathering volunteers from the community to help deliver food and PPE to those in need. So if anyone is interested in doing any of that work, we would love to have you join us. Please just, you know, feel free to hit Josh on chat now, or you can email at info@graceleeforassembly.com and we'll get you signed up right away. The other question I wanted to address is, Jan asked on the chat, to bring this back to a hyper-local level as we face the June election, what's my take on current deficiencies and how the 65th Assembly District has failed, and how will you change that? And so when it comes to Asian American discrimination, something that I've been observing from our elected officials and kind of goes back to what we were talking about is like, there needs to be more than platitudes. Our elected officials and all of our public officials really need to take a proactive stance here. I've seen a lot of victimization by our elected officials, Asian American elected officials, who have a lot of complaints, who are reporting the issues, but then not doing anything about it. And so what we really need to do is have more proactive people who are going to find solutions, who are going to work closely with the DA's office, who are going to work closely with law enforcement to ensure that these issues could start to be addressed. And then on a second level, you know, I think, thanks, Jan, for asking this question, because Chinatown, very early on, due to racist fears about the coronavirus, were disproportionately affected economically by this issue. And, you know, many of the elected officials saw this issue as like, oh, well, why don't we just encourage people to go to Chinatown and dine in Chinatown? They created hashtags, they took pictures of themselves, you know, eating at restaurants. But if you went and actually spoke to restaurant owners, you spoke to small business owners, which is something that I did very on in February and March, you got to understand that this issue was beyond encouraging people to go out and dine in, you know, dine in Chinatown and put their dollars there, that the damage was so deep and extensive that this was something that many Asian American businesses were going to have a very difficult time getting themselves out of. You know, 50% month over month declines in revenues are very difficult. That's extremely difficult to recover from. And so, you know, I was very proactive in proposing policies to help Chinatown businesses, you know, get relief that they needed, get business loans and grants that they needed in order to survive. And that is something now that kind of applies to all of Lower Manhattan, frankly, New York City, New York State, and the country because of the shutdown. But, you know, another concern that I have specifically for the ethnic communities that I represent is their ability to access the programs that have been put in place by the federal government and the city government. We are seeing that that many of these ethnic small businesses are not getting the same type of access to loans and to grants that other businesses are getting. And you know, as an advocate, as a elected official, I will be fighting to ensure that funds that are put out to small businesses, that are put out to the community, are more equitably distributed, and that you know, we have, like, you know, whether it's legal services, accounting services, and you know, translations, so that people can navigate the system. I think all of those are really important, and I don't see that happening right now for these communities, and we need strong advocates to be able to help them.
We definitely do. And that's why it's important that we help Grace get elected. So filmmakers, like I say, going on all the time. Contact information we just put in the chat, bit.ly/calls for Grace, josh@graceleeforassembly.com. The online discussion, but we need new leadership now more than ever. Grace, thank you for having these every week, Sunday, 4 o'clock. Everybody's encouraged to continue to join. Next week's discussion topic will be coming out very shortly. Subscribe, stay engaged, follow Grace on social media, and we'll keep the conversation going. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, and a special thank you to Chris and Tobita for joining us today. We really appreciate you being here, and look forward to continuing this conversation. It's definitely not over yet, and let's help to get great leaders elected. That's how we continue to move this conversation forward. Thank you, everyone.